Hey folks, I'm back with round 9 from the 2025 Reykjavik Open. This was the final round that just took place at 10:30 this morning Reykjavik time. And yeah, very important game going into this round. I had 5.5 points out of 8. Definitely a good performance. And for this final round, I was paired against Icelandic International Master Jon Viktor Gunnarsson. So wasn't a ton of time to prepare for the game because it was just overnight, but I did see that he's playing e4 and usually going for the open Sicilian. So I decided for this game to play the Najdorf, d6, takes, knight f6, knight c3, a6. And my opponent has played a couple different systems according to the database, so I wasn't sure what exactly I was going to see here. But he ends up playing this move rook to g1, which I learned is called the freak attack. And the idea of this one is to push g4. Very similar to the h3 line that actually I've played myself with white. White tries to go g4, g5, and get this typical Kara style attack. So this happened to me one of the lines I checked this morning. So I happened to have some idea of what I wanted to do here. I decided to play g6, kind of transposing to a dragon structure. White goes g4, and now knight c6. And this is some kind of like move order trickery that I think is important for black. For whatever reason, it's less precise to start with bishop to g7. So I play knight c6, white continues g5, knight d7, and now white went bishop e3, and I played h6. So we'll come back to this. If white were to start with h4, then I think I would play bishop g7, hitting the knight, bishop e3, and now h5. This was how my preparation went, and to me it looked like black's position is quite reasonable here, because if white takes en passant, I can take with the bishop and my structure is good. If white does not take en passant, then the king side is closed, and it's going to take white a long time to get like f4, f5 in with strong effect. And whenever they do play f5, that of course gives up the e5 square. In the meantime, black can maybe play knight c5, knight e6, try to trade some pieces off and get some counterplay eventually on the queen side. So instead, white played bishop e3. Again, h4 was possible. And here I played h6. And okay, I mean, Engine shows this move, so I played it. But the idea is to open up the rook on the h file. So I think it does make some sense. White goes h4, take. Now, of course, I'm never going to be castling kingside, rather playing with my king in the center, or possibly going queenside, just like white's king is on e1. Bishop g7, queen d2, and now knight de5. And yeah, there's a nice trick here that I end up getting in the game, although I'm not really sure how white is supposed to avoid the trick, if they can at all, because after knight e5, I'm threatening to take on d4, and then I have knight f3 check, but I'm also threatening knight g4. So for example, if castles knight g4, this is kind of annoying for white, because I'm hitting the dark square bishop. The knight on d4 is loose as well, and so white, I think, has to give up the bishop pair here, and I get this really strong dark square bishop. I could take on d4, but then, like, if bishop takes d4, there's knight f3. But here I think queen takes d4, and my bishop on g7 is hanging, so I don't have any immediate jumps with the knight. So I'm not sure what's going on here. Probably I would just go knight g4. So instead, white played bishop e2 here, covering f3 and g4, but it turns out black can play knight g4 anyway, which is a trick I discovered before the game. And the point is that white can take once, but they cannot take twice in view of rook h1 check at the end, winning the exchange. King e2, rook takes a1, and yeah, white doesn't really have enough here. So I was really happy to get this in, and I remember the Engine saying that like the best white could do was to take on c6, go bishop d4, and then black would play e5, forcing the bishop back, and then I could take this bishop, and let's say after queen takes e3, Engine gives this position as being equal, but optically, you know, it feels kind of nice for black. I got the dark squared bishop, I have the center now, I'm covering the d5 square, my bishop can come out to e6, so I feel like I would definitely prefer black's chances here, which of course means that the line is not so easy for white to handle. So instead, my opponent ends up giving up the light square bishop, which I think is quite reasonable. I play bishop takes, and now he goes f4. And now my bishop on g4 is hanging because white is threatening to take and then bring the rook back to g1 to cover the check, so I do have to do something about this guy. And if I play a move like queen d7 supporting the bishop, then I thought knight d5 is unpleasant, where white is threatening knight to b6, so I have to like move my rook, but knight b6 is a huge threat anyway because my queen doesn't have a lot of squares to keep the bishop defended. So I wasn't sure exactly what's going on here. I thought, very easily I could make one mistake and land in trouble if I miss some kind of tactical idea like this. So I also thought about bishop d7 here, but then again I didn't really like this move knight d5 from white, where white is starting to take on c6 and then follow up with bishop b6, this kind of idea, and then knight c7 check at the end. Or let's say if rook c8, knight takes c6, I would have to take with the bishop. If pawn takes, bishop b6 wins my queen. Bishop takes, actually this doesn't look that bad for black because of bishop b6, queen d7. And yeah, all my pieces have reasonable squares. I have the two bishops. My bishop on g7 is open. f6 is covered, so the knight doesn't have any jumps. Yeah, I think actually this would be quite reasonable for black. In fact, maybe I would also prefer black slightly here, because I feel like my rook on the h-file is really strong, and light square bishop can trade off whenever, and so on. So this was probably completely playable, bishop d7, knight d5, and rook c8. But I decided to be a little bit more concrete here, and I end up taking on d4. And my idea after bishop takes d4 was to follow up with e5, so this happened in the game. Now if white takes this one, I'll go de, and definitely trade the queens off. And I thought I would be really happy in some endgame like this, where I have the two bishops once again, really active pieces. In the long run, white has some weaknesses on the king side, like g-pawn and e-pawn can definitely be targets. Got like b5, b4. So definitely I thought black is already kind of playing for the advantage here. So white, of course, did not take. He goes bishop e3. And originally my thought here was take queen b6, which I thought was very annoying for white, because I'm hitting the rook on g1 and the pawn on b2. The bishop on g4 still can't be taken because of rook h1 check, winning the rook or the exchange. And otherwise, if bishop e3, I'm just taking on b2, and the knight and rook are both hanging, and so this just looks like white is losing. So I was thinking on e5, bishop f2, white would play. And here my bishop on g4 is hanging, so I'm not really in time to take on f4. But my plan was to drop back, I believe, bishop e6. And yeah, I thought this position was quite reasonable for black, because at some point I can take on f4, open up my bishops, go queen a5, rook c8, and it seemed like very healthy counterplay and kind of a nice dragon. Maybe I'll shuffle my king over to g8 and then just keep one rook on the h-file to make sure that I don't get mated. So I was definitely okay with this. I also considered white could take here. I would take and then go knight e2. But this position, I thought black is actually maybe quite happy. So I would start with something like queen d7 possibly. Let's say the rook goes back to g1. And I think I was thinking like queen to, let's say, c6, hitting the e-pawn, queen d3. And then, I forget exactly what I wanted to do here, but it was something like rook c8, rook h2, and although the d-pawn is blockaded, I did think I have like very active pieces to compensate for it. So to me, it looked really hard for white to try and do anything with this d-pawn. If he ever takes on d4, of course, c2 is going to be hanging, but otherwise it's hard to defend c2. Maybe I can go queen c4 somewhere, but I wasn't totally sure. To me, this position actually felt pretty unclear, maybe even close to equal. I wasn't sure if black is playing for an edge or not. But I was fine to go into that position. But instead, white plays bishop e3 after a long think. And of course, previously I thought, well, ef4, bishop f4, queen b6 was just good for black. And indeed, I think this position is very good for black. But then I realized white's idea is to meet ef4 with bishop d4, which is actually quite an annoying move, because white is hitting the bishop on g7, and the bishop on g4 is also hanging, because white can take and bring the rook back to g1. And if I take on d4, white has queen d4 hitting the rook. I'd have to play rook h4 to defend the bishop. But this is very awkward. For example, knight to d5, and white is threatening knight f6 check, as well as rook takes g4, followed by queen h8 mate. So I think I was trying to make this work for a second, queen takes g5, but if nothing else, white can just go knight c7 check, pick up this other rook, and my pieces are in no position to create counterplay here. So I think I'm just down a rook. So ef4, bishop d4, I actually couldn't find a move here, because, again, both bishops are hanging. If I defend the bishop on g7, white will win the bishop on g4. So bishop e5, rook takes g4. check, rook back to g1. So on bishop e3, I realized probably I can't take on f4, and I started looking for another move. I decided to go bishop e6 because now my bishop is threatened on g4. I could also play bishop h5. We discussed this briefly after the game, because this move comes with the advantage that it prevents white from castling. But of course, the bishop on h5 is a little bit weird because it's like somewhat misplaced. So yeah, I wasn't sure what kind of position this would be. Like white could maybe continue knight to d5. And it's hard to say because the knight on d5 is very strong. I can't really challenge it, but white's rook on a1 is not getting in the game. So yeah, tough to evaluate this position. I also considered bishop f3, which I thought was interesting because on knight d5 I can take the e-pawn. But bishop on f3 doesn't really feel very, very secure. Like queen f2, for example, rook h3 would be the idea, just to hold on to this bishop, make sure white doesn't castle. And yeah, again, I found it very hard to judge, so I didn't really think I had to do this. So instead I go back, bishop e6. Now white finally castles, now that he's allowed, and rook c8. So here I actually thought my position is very, very reasonable, because again, the two bishops are strong, and I have this incoming counterplay on the king side. If white takes this pawn on d6, maybe I have other options like queen a5 or something active, but I was also thinking I can just go for the endgame, take on f4. And now I'm down a pawn, so I'd like to win the pawn back, but I don't want to take on c3. I definitely don't want to take twice because of bishop e5, but in general, I didn't want to take on c3 because I thought this endgame could actually be extremely scary. Bishop e5, the bishop comes to f6, white's other rook doubles on d1, and it seems like black could just get mated, with the two rooks and opposite color bishops. However, my intention was basically never to take on c3, but rather to activate with a move like rook h4. And although black is down a pawn here, I actually thought black has very reasonable compensation. Yeah, I thought black is basically doing okay. If bishop g3, I can go rook to g4 and pin the bishop this way. If bishop e3, I can go bishop e5 and then first kick white's rook out. And then at some point, maybe I do take on c3 and start picking up pawns as long as my king is not in some kind of mating net. So this definitely felt like very reasonable compensation. If rook f1 here, then there's ideas of like rook takes f4 and bishop e5. And then white would have to give back the exchange with rook takes e6, fe, something like rook to d3. And yeah, again, black is down a pawn. It's kind of hard to say, but I imagine the compensation here is very, very reasonable. Rook c4, rook c5 is also possible, followed by trading and then winning the g-pawn. So ultimately, yeah, I did think that black is more or less okay here, and I still do. I don't know if black is playing for advantage, but I definitely thought that, I should never be worse in this kind of endgame, which I think was correct. So instead, white played rook h1, which I definitely felt like was another critical move, trying to take over the h-file. And now I don't really have a lot of great options. If I cede the file, then my rook on g8 is just super, super passive. So I decided I probably have to take. Rook takes h1. And now this is a little bit annoying with like rook h7 ideas, but my king is covering with king f8. So it's not so bad, I thought. And here I decided to start with king f8. I considered other moves as well. Actually, in almost every position, I was considering e takes f4. But then bishop d4 would often discourage me from playing this because here it feels like white is really coming close on the dark squares. Like if king f8, already white has takes queen d4 check, and black can resign because we're just falling under a huge attack. h8 is a problem. I think I have to go f6, but now it takes. And if queen takes f6, rook h7 check just picks up the queen. So these kinds of tactics are still looming in the position, so I have to be very careful about e takes f4. I also thought about queen a5, but then queen takes d6. And I really wanted to take on c3, or even go like ef4 and then take on c3. But ef4 again, bishop d4 is unpleasant. And let's say I take here first and take here. I also thought white can just take this way. There's other things as well, but here the problem is I don't have any checks. If I take something, then white has queen b8 check, and it's my king that's in big trouble, it would seem. Though I don't know, there could be other stuff here after ef4, for example. Bishop d4 once again is a huge possibility. So this stuff didn't seem to be too great, although I could go rook d8 in this position. like this. And maybe this would have been worth going for. For example, white can play either queen c5 or queen b6. I think I was thinking queen b6, take with tempo. And then if rook d6, bishop c7. Wasn't totally sure what's going on here because now white is already up a pawn and then maybe even winning a second pawn, right? So who knows? Maybe maybe I have enough compensation here. Takes, rook c5. I am winning one pawn back, but yeah, no, hard to say. I mean, we're probably winning one pawn back and then maybe have compensation for the second. I would say white is never really risking to lose here. For example, knight d5 can be played, and here white's just up a pawn in the rook endgame. I think, again, black has very reasonable compensation for the pawn, but I would imagine white should be holding this with best play. Or maybe black is holding it with best play. I don't know who's who's in more danger there of getting worse. So, yeah, that was possible, but didn't feel super clear to me. So I ended up just going king f8, which just seemed like a useful prophylactic move, maybe bringing the king to g8 to cover the h7 square, just getting out of the way. And then eventually I do want to take on f4, maybe even put the bishop on e5 once I'm solid enough. So here comes knight d5, which I was definitely expecting because I think it's just one of the more logical moves, just bringing the knight in. And I don't have to take this knight, but I also was having a hard time finding a different move for black, because if I put the king on g8, there's always some kind of knight f6 check possibilities, and I'm not sure if that's working, but I often wouldn't want to give up my dark square bishop here because then my dark squares would be left very, very weak. So at this point, I'm down to 21 minutes. My opponent has 18 minutes, and we have 19 more moves to go to make it to the time control. So I decided to take on d5, queen takes d5, and queen c7, hitting c2, white goes c3, and now queen c6. And this is basically what I had in mind when I played king f8. I thought we would reach this position more or less. And I thought this endgame is quite safe for black because my king is close. I have ef4 at some point to open up the bishop. And yeah, white might have some weaknesses to deal with on the king side. If rook d1, for example, I was thinking take. Let's say rook takes, and then rook c4. I thought was a nice move. And white's not really in time here with like f5 or anything because e4 is hanging. So here, I mean, white could easily, I think, find themselves worse. Let's say rook takes d6, rook takes e4, bishop c5, and king g8. If check, I have king h7. And now the problem for white is like this g-pawn is always just a huge target in these positions. And if I win the g-pawn, I have two protected passers on the king side supported by the king, which would be, yeah, super, super strong. I don't know objectively if black, has anything here. I haven't checked the game at all with the engine, but again, those were just my thoughts during the game. So white ends up going queen takes c6. So he just goes for the endgame directly. I decided to take with the pawn because I had already seen my opponent's next move coming, f5. And I thought if he's going to go f5, I should take and try to push d5, and then I want my pawns closer to the center. Maybe rook takes was interesting as well, because here on f5, let's say rook c4. No, white has f6, and I'm not in time because white's taking with check. So this wasn't working. But if my king was on g8, maybe I would be in time to meet f6 with rook takes e4, or f6, of course, I can also drop back with bishop f8. So f5, I would have to go here, king g8, and or maybe take once and king g8. I'm not sure. Probably take once. And in this structure, I just decided I'd rather have my pawn on c6 so that I can better support d5. But I'm not sure. Maybe it's better to have the rook here so that my rook can activate via rook c4, rook e4, rook g4, and so on. Probably black is okay, but maybe it's not so easy. So I decided to take with the pawn. And here comes f5, which I basically expected because it's kind of the only way for white to really push here. If he takes on e5, otherwise I'm very ready to take on f4. But if he takes on e5, I'll take with the bishop. And here I think my bishop is really strong. My pawns are defendable. I can go king e7, king e6. At some point, if white gives up the h-file, I'll go rook h8 and take over. Otherwise, maybe I'll start playing on the b-file. So yeah, this definitely looked perfectly healthy for black. So white goes f5. I take, pawn takes, and king g8. And this was kind of my idea. I thought if white goes f6, bishop f8, I look very passive. But at the same time, there's not much white can actually do to break through on the king side. And I want to go d5 and bishop d6 and just slowly start getting my stuff out, c5, d4, and I can create two protected passers in the center. And the issue for white is that if he ever tries to move his rook somewhere, well, then my king is able to get in. King h7, king g6, and the g-pawn is going to be a weakness here too. So here I thought actually I had a very reasonable position. But now goes king d2. And then I played d5 here. Pretty quickly. I think I ended up only spending about a minute on this move, which is a bit of a shame because after bishop c5, I really lamented not having played bishop f8 first and allowing this. Because if I played bishop f8 first in this position, then white doesn't have a super useful move. Let's say just king d3, I'll go d5, and then white's bishop doesn't activate. I can get my bishop out with bishop d6, and this looked very, very solid to me. Maybe I'll put the king on g7. I mean, who knows? Maybe white is still pressing here a little bit. I'm not really sure, but compared to the game, I think this is probably much safer for black. So in the game we have d5, but now bishop c5. My bishop on g7 is a little bit stuck. Probably I should have just pushed e4. Maybe rook b8 first, b4 or something from white, and then e4 here for black. And maybe this is not so bad because if allowed, I just want to go bishop e5 and get my bishop out, threaten bishop f4 check. And basically, I just need white to push one of his pawns to commit so that I can try and use the squares to get in. So if f6, bishop f8, let's say takes, rook takes, here, yeah, I'm not really sure what's going on because like white is very active, but I can go rook e8, rook e5, and so white's definitely going to have some pawns to defend. King e3, I can also try a5, play on the queen side. If takes, rook a8, and my rook is getting quite active. It's hard to say because who knows? Maybe one day white can try and come in and try to win f7. But if white goes rook b1, I'll go king h7, king g6, bring my king in. Eventually, the rook will activate as well. So this position, I feel like black is probably okay, given that my king is being able to enter. So bishop c5, I went bishop f8. Thinking my bishop is very passive and I have to try and trade it off, but probably was better to play with e4, thinking about it now. So takes, rook takes, and now rook h6. A very annoying move, and I totally missed this one. I was mainly expecting rook h4 and trying to swing over to the queen side, but somehow rook h6 escaped me, and now white is hitting everything on the 6th rank, and all of a sudden things start to get very unpleasant for black because, I was thinking like, okay, I could go rook c8, then white plays maybe rook d6, and yeah, I was having a hard time figuring out how to play this position because I'm just kind of passive and white can just slowly build up b4, a4, a5, eventually start bringing in the king. And yeah, I'm never comfortable when I have to just kind of sit and wait in an endgame like this. Looking at it now, I didn't do any postmortem yet, but now I'm thinking maybe it was not so bad, like king f8, try to go king e7. If white plays f6, then I'll come back around this way, looking to go king h7, king g6. But even this, white starts with rook to d7 to tie black down. And yeah, optically, actually, it doesn't look great. At least, yeah, during the game, I started feeling very uncomfortable. So I'm not really sure. Maybe black is already in some trouble here. The other option I would have is like rook b8, I was thinking, but then just b3, white defends. I don't want to go rook b6 here. That feels extremely passive, and it doesn't make a huge difference. Now, once again, white goes rook d6. Somewhere, white will play f6. And yeah, it's just going to be really hard for me to get my king out because of this like rook d7 idea. So here, white just does nothing. If I go king f8, then maybe f6, king g8, rook to d7, and I'm kind of stuck. And as soon as I start pushing my pawns, white's king will enter and start taking them. So yeah, my feeling right now, of course, I have to confirm with the engine, but my feeling right now is this is already difficult for black to hold. At least I didn't see anything clear. Definitely not. So bishop f8 might have been a really bad decision, given that rook h6 is so strong. Probably I should have moved the rook, and yeah, I would rather play this position. I'm still not sure if black is okay here, but I think at least I would have better chances. So takes rook h6. And at this point, I got very nervous about this line with rook c8, rook d6. I really didn't like that position for black. So I decided to play f6, which is a very risky move, sacrificing a pawn. And yeah, well, my idea is if white takes with the rook, then of course I can trade rooks and go king f7. And in fact, white might lose this king and pawn endgame because both these f pawns are falling. So this looks pretty bad for white. And if gf, well, then the pawns really aren't scary and the rook is kind of blocked. So I could play like rook b8 here and then king f7. Let's say b3, king f7. And then something like this, I think black would be totally fine because my king is getting in, my rook can activate as well. And yeah, white's up a pawn, but it feels only temporary. So white can also play g6, and this was probably the move I was worried about the most. But my idea was to play rook to b8, hitting the pawn, and then if like b3 or something, rook b7, so that white cannot invade with rook h7, rook f7, this kind of thing. And this also looked very passive, so I wasn't like totally happy to enter this position, but at least I have this kind of strong pawn chain, this like reverse bathtub thing with f6, d5, e5, c6. But yeah, it's hard to say. You know, my plan would be to try and push a5, a4 or c5, c4, try to activate my rook, bring it around to f1 and target this f5 pawn. You know, that would be the main plan for black. And it's hard to say what's the evaluation here. But yeah, I think I would take white, but you know, still hard to play, and you never know. If white loses this f pawn, then of course position can go sour very quickly. So on f6, my opponent goes rook g6 check, king h7, and gf. And yeah, to be honest, I just really underestimated throwing in rook g6 check first, because now of course my king is cut off, so I'm not getting the king to f7. I couldn't play king f7 here because rook takes f6. He takes the second pawn, and so that would be really bad. So I go king h7, and now g takes f6. And now this is kind of rough because I thought, oh, maybe I have rook g8 here to force a rook trade and his pawns are weak, but then white goes f7. And I can't take for a number of reasons. White can recapture, white can promote to a queen, or white can even promote to a knight, which maybe is the simplest. Check, and then he's up a piece. So here I'd have to go rook f8, and then white can take this one. Let's say rook takes f7, white takes on a6, I take on f5. Some endgame like this looked very, very bad for me because I'm down a pawn, my king is farther away, and white's rook is very, very active here. So I don't know, some move like rook e6. Maybe there's more precise way like b4. But yeah, this didn't look good at all for black because my pawns are just not going anywhere, and white's pawns on the queen side are very strong. So once I don't have rook g8 f7, now things become very tricky because white wants to just start pushing on the queen side, and at some point he's going to pitch this f pawn and then start taking everything. So maybe I could sit here with rook f7. But yeah, then white starts advancing, you know, a4 or b3 or b4 or something. And I mean, I can't sit forever because eventually white will just start to bring in the king d3, c4. And if the king gets in, then I'm just losing all my pawns on the queen side. But in the meantime, my king is stuck on h7 and my rook can't really move so easily. You know, I can just shuffle back and forth on the 7th rank. I don't know, maybe this was a better try. If I move my rook this way, for example, then let's say white goes b3 or b4, and then I always have to watch out for f7 stuff. So after some thought, I played a5. And the idea here is that when white pushes f7, I can take, he takes on c6, I'll take on f5, my a pawn won't be hanging on a6. But now white goes a4. I think very nice move. And now I have new issues, because now white's starting to create a passer with b4. So if I play rook f7 here, all of a sudden, let's say white can start with b4, take, and then white's next move is rook g7 check. Okay, here I guess I could still go back. So I think more accurate would be just rook g7 immediately. Force the rook trade while white can do it. Take, and my king is just very far away. So b4, and looks like white's winning this one because I'm not stopping the a pawn. So now white has this rook g7 check idea in the position, so I can't even play rook f7. And if I move my rook somewhere, then like rook b8, for example, Just king c2, I thought. And at some point, white's pushing f7, so I'm going to have to bring my rook back to f8. So a4, I panicked here, and I pushed d4. Because basically, I just didn't know what to do. I also thought about c5. But on c5, I thought, okay, number one, white can just wait and do nothing. But I also didn't really like the looks of just the immediate f7. Number one, white can also just start by bringing in the king and maybe get a better version of this. But something like this looked pretty rough for black. I go check, king c1, and all my pawns are hanging on the 5th rank, and I just didn't see how I'm saving this. Check, the king can go to b3 or b1, and yeah, I'm just losing one after the other. So rook d2 maybe is the best try. Take e4, but I'm not really in time. Rook a6, cutting off the king. e3, rook e6, e2, and now I have no threat. White can just push the a pawn and win the game. So yeah, all these rook endgames started to look very bad for me. And yeah, not knowing what to do, I tried d4, just hoping to maybe trade some pawns off, push c5, but it really started to look very, very ugly. King d3. Now if I take on c3, I think white can take either way, but probably I was thinking with pawn, and then the king even walks up this way, not even towards the queen side anymore, but now just king e4, king takes e5. And, you know, my king is stuck in a box, my rook is also kind of stuck, and just seems lost. So what to do? I played c5. At this point, I'm pretty much burning all my time. I only have to make 6 more moves before the time control, so you know what to do. I have to spend all my time here trying to find the save, but I couldn't do it. c5, he goes king e4, and now the king is just entering. Yeah, I mean, I considered rook d8 here, but to try to push d3. Yeah, number one, I think white could take d3, and let's say go back d2, rook d1, and I don't really think I'm saving this position because my pawns are inevitably weak. Maybe it's not so simple. Maybe I could try bringing in the king, but let's say white starts walking back. I'm losing the d pawn. And yeah, I'm going to be at least down 1 pawn on the queen side, but now the problem is, like, when I move my rook somewhere, you know, of course, white's king is just getting in very, very quickly. And so my king is too far away. So something like this, even though I'm only down a pawn, if my king was on the queen side, if I could take and move my king to b6, then of course that would be drawn 3 versus 2. But with my king very far away, I think these kinds of positions are almost always losing because I just can't defend the queen side anymore. So with rook d8 not looking good, I tried rook g8. Of course, you know, hoping for the king and pawn endgame. Takes, which I thought would be very unclear. Because if white takes, I can take with the e-pawn, I think. And now white's king can't really advance because of d3, and white's pawns aren't really going anywhere. In fact, here, white might even be losing. Yeah, here white might even just be losing because eventually I'm taking both of these pawns, and the king can't really do much. If b4, I just take with the c-pawn. So of course, that would be great. Or if king takes e5, then I would push d3, and once again, the king and pawn endgame actually would just be good for black because the d pawn is running through. Unfortunately, of course, white has the resource f7 as before, which was played. But yeah, I didn't know what else to do. I think white could also take here first, and then if d3 go f7 like this, but this is less not as simple. Also, on king takes e5, let's say I could trade rooks, and then we would get, I believe, a queen endgame. Although I just realized, well, okay, this would be the queen endgame. d2, queen, queen, and white should have very good winning chances because he's up a pawn and his king is better. And so, yeah, a-pawn is hanging right now, but I think still really good chances for white to win this. Probably winning. But also, I mean, this is just much simpler. White doesn't have to go for the king and pawn endgame. He can just take this one and for the queen and pawn endgame. He can just go for the king and pawn, and of course this is trivial. So yeah, I mean, rook j8, I just had no time and everything else looked losing. So what to do? He goes f7. I go back. Takes. I took here. I just don't really have any great options for black at this point. He's more active. And let's say I take here, for example, take on f7. White will come here and just gobble up all the pawns. So king takes e5, rook takes f7. White takes on d4, I take back. And now just simple move rook d6, picking up the pawn with the rook and not letting me get anywhere with my own rook. And here, unfortunately, if I go rook b7, which would be like the most logical move, I'm just not in time. Rook takes d4, rook takes b2, rook d5. And then white is taking the a-pawn here. And with 2 extra pawns, it's a pretty easy win, as white just kind of can slowly push everything forward and eventually choose which pawn to promote based on whichever pawn my king is not in front of. So if I keep my king on f7, for example, then white can just start running the a-pawn and eventually just ditch the f-pawn, run with the king towards the queen side, promote the pawn, and yeah, it's always losing. So at this point, it's over. It's move 39. I have no time. I go rook e7 check. King takes, rook to b7. Just hoping, maybe he'll miss rook b4 check, rook takes a4. Of course, that didn't happen. King c3 was played. And here I decided to resign after thinking for a few minutes because we reached the time control, move 41. So I took a few minutes to kind of acquiesce to the rook endgame in front of us and realized, it's a very straightforward win for white and decided to just stop the clock. We can play it out a bit. If rook b4, white has b3, and then his next move is rook d5, and he's taking the a-pawn. Let's say I just hold on to this one. White can do all kinds of things, but I was thinking just like b4 is probably good enough. Takes, and if check, the king can advance. Let's say here I go here. Check, rook b6. But this is like the simplest plan for white, is like just putting the rook on the b file, and then the a-pawn is just running forward. And yeah, my king is just way too far to defend against the a-pawn. Even if the f-pawn wasn't on the board, this would just be completely winning for white because his a-pawn is too good. So unfortunately, that was it. After king c3, I just resigned. I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. I saw, the end game is lost, and yeah, decided to call it a day. So a bit of a bummer. I was quite happy with this game at first. I thought I got some good prep in, and my position felt very dynamic and fluid. But yeah, to be fair, it was never easy, in this kind of position to play with the king in the center. Even though I kind of like my chances with the 2 bishops, strategically, black is taking a lot of risk with the king in the center of the board. And yeah, we ended up getting this endgame, which I think was very critical. And I think, yeah, what I regret the most about this game was just this move d5, because I played it pretty quickly. I have 18 minutes on the clock. I spent about a minute here. Granted, I'm trying to get to the time control. We have 13 moves to go, but I really wish I had considered this kind of simple move bishop f8 first. I haven't checked with the computer, so who knows, maybe black is already worse or struggling here, but at least over the board after the game, blindfold, been thinking about this position. I don't quite see why it's so dangerous for black. I'm getting d5 in and bishop d6. So yeah, I feel like probably I should have at least held this one. I think a draw would have been a reasonable result, but unfortunately we got into some trouble and then ended up losing the endgame, which happens. So yeah, that does it for my tournament. I end with 5.5 out of 9. My performance rating, I think, is like very similar to my actual rating. It was like 23.52 or something. Apparently I'm gaining maybe 2 FIDE points. So that was definitely good. To lose the last round and still gain some points, I think means you're having a good tournament. And yeah, I definitely wanted to score in this game, but what are you gonna do? Chess is a tough game, and it doesn't always go your way. So what I'm hoping is to learn from this game, because I think I was fine in the opening, fine in the middle game, and then in the end game I had serious problems. So maybe it's a sign that it's like time to work on the end games more. I did have some nice end games in this tournament, but yeah, as you can see, there's always room for improvement. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thanks for watching these videos. I really enjoyed doing the recaps once again. It's great to just kind of share my thoughts after the game, and it feels like people appreciate them and like to watch. Next up, I will be playing the Reykjavik Open, which actually starts in 2 days in Germany. So I'm traveling tomorrow, and hopefully we'll make it there on time. It's going to be 9 more rounds, 9 very, very tough games. Hopefully I'll be able to do recaps again. I'm not sure because Grenke is a very tough schedule. It's 2 rounds per day throughout. So, I'll do my best, but I might not get to all the recaps so quickly, in which case I'll have to complete them after the tournament. Because during the tournament, I do have to focus on getting proper rest and preparing for the games and so on. So if there's no time for the recaps, then of course they're gonna have to go. But hopefully it all works out, and we continue to play chess, continue to learn. The journey for Grandmaster continues. I'm still very much in love with the game. I've got a whole new hunger for chess analysis, and yeah, it sucks. It hurts. It hurts to lose. It really stings. But you got to take the lows with the highs. And overall, I do think the tournament was a great experience for me. Very, very memorable, I have to say. I have a lot of stories, great stories to tell from this tournament, maybe for another time. Gotta keep working. All right, thanks for watching. Hopefully I will see you in the next video. Take care.